The night was cold on the mining world of Eryndor-7. Strong winds moved through the metal streets of the colony, carrying dust and smoke from the giant factory towers above. Most workers had already gone home. Shops were closed. Neon signs flickered, quietly in the dark. Only the patrol drones still moved through the empty streets. Kael Mercer walked slowly toward his apartment building with a heavy toolbox hanging from one hand. His back hurt after 12 long hours repairing broken cargo machines at Dock Sector 9. Oil stains covered his gray work jacket, and his boots made soft sounds against the wet metal road. He wanted only two things: food and sleep. Kael was not a hero. He stayed away from trouble. He fixed machines, earned credits, and lived alone. That was enough for him. At least it had been enough before tonight. As he passed the old shipping yard near the edge of the colony, he suddenly stopped walking. A sound reached him. Very soft, very weak. Crying. Kael frowned and looked around. The street was empty. Wind moved through broken cargo containers nearby. Then he heard it again. A child. Not loud crying. Small, broken sounds, like someone trying very hard not to be heard. Kael slowly walked toward the dark alley between two giant storage crates. His hand tightened around the toolbox handle. "Hello?" he called carefully. No answer. The crying stopped. Kael stepped deeper into the shadows. A broken overhead light flashed above him every few seconds. The alley smelled like rust and rainwater. Then, he saw movement behind a pile of old containers. A child. Small. Thin. Curled tightly against the wall. Kael froze. The little girl was not human. Her skin had a soft silver-blue color. Long white hair covered part of her face. Her clothes were torn and dirty, hanging loosely from her tiny body. She looked weak, like she had not eaten in days. But it was her eyes that caught him. Large, black eyes filled with fear. The girl held a small piece of broken plastic close to her chest like she thought it was food. Kael slowly lowered his toolbox. "Onto the ground." "It's okay," he said quietly. The child pressed herself harder against the wall. Her whole body shook. Kael noticed bruises on her thin arms. Fresh bruises. Something inside his chest tightened. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said gently. Still no answer, only fear. Kael slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a wrapped protein bar from work. He carefully placed it on the ground between them and stepped back. The girl stared at it, then stared at him. Her breathing was fast and nervous. "It's food," Kael said softly. For several long seconds, she did not move. Then slowly, carefully, she crawled forward like a frightened animal. She grabbed the food bar quickly and moved back into the corner. Kael watched quietly as she tore, the wrapper open with shaking hands. She ate fast, too fast, like someone afraid the food would disappear. Kael looked away for a moment, trying to hide the pain on his face. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked quietly. The girl did not answer. After finishing the food, she held the empty wrapper tightly in her hands. Kael crouched down carefully. "What's your name?" The girl looked at him silently. Then finally, in a tiny voice, she whispered something. "Lyra." Kael nodded slowly. "Lyra," he repeated gently. "That's a beautiful name." The little girl lowered her eyes. Kael looked around the empty alley. "Where are your parents?" he asked carefully. "Your family?" At once, fear returned to her face. She quickly shook her head. Kael immediately understood he asked the wrong question. "It's okay," he said softly. "You don't have to tell me." Lyra looked exhausted. Dark circles sat under her eyes. Her small hands trembled from cold. Kael removed his jacket and slowly held it out toward her. She hesitated, then carefully took it. The jacket almost swallowed her tiny body completely. Kael stood and looked toward the dark streets outside the alley. The colony at night was dangerous even for adults. For a small alien child alone? Impossible. He looked back at her. "You can stay at my place tonight," he said quietly. "Just until morning." Lyra immediately looked frightened again. "No cell," she whispered weakly. Kael felt something heavy hit his chest. "No," he said firmly. "Never." The girl stared at him for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if humans could really tell the truth. Finally, very slowly, she stood up. Her legs shook from weakness. Kael carefully held out his hand. After several seconds, she took it. Her fingers were freezing cold. Together, they walked through the dark colony streets. Patrol drones floated above them, while factory lights burned high in the night sky. Lyra stayed close to Kael the entire time, nervously watching every shadow they passed. When they finally reached his apartment building, she stopped walking. Her eyes widened. The building was old and small, but warm light shined through the windows. Kael unlocked the door and looked back at her. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Lyra stared at the room like she had never seen a real home before. Couch, lights, warm air, no chains, no cages, no shouting voices. Kael walked into the kitchen corner and heated a bowl of soup while Lyra stood silently near the door. "You can sit down," he told her gently. Slowly, she sat on the edge of the couch. Still, ready to run. Kael handed her the warm bowl carefully. The little girl held it with both hands like it was treasure. Then she looked up at him nervously. "You human?" she asked softly. Kael smiled a little. "Yeah," he answered. "I'm human." Lyra stared quietly into the soup. Then in a tiny voice, almost too soft to hear, she whispered, "My mama said humans dangerous." Kael sat down across from her. "Sometimes," he said honestly. "Some are." Lyra looked up slowly. "But not you?" she asked. Kael was quiet for a moment. Then he answered softly, "I'm trying not to be." The next few days felt strange to Kael. Not bad, just different. For the first time in many years, his apartment no longer felt empty. Every morning, he woke to the quiet sound of movement in the kitchen. Lyra would already be awake, sitting near, the small window with her knees against her chest, watching the colony outside. Sometimes she held the stuffed fabric toy Kael bought her from a street market. Sometimes she simply stared at the sky, like she was waiting for someone. She still spoke very little, but little by little she stopped looking afraid every second. That alone felt like progress. Kael noticed many things about her. She always hid extra food inside her pockets. She flinched whenever someone knocked on a nearby door, and every night before sleeping, she checked the apartment locks 3 different times, like she had learned long ago that safety never lasted. One evening, Kael returned home carrying a small backpack. Lyra looked up from the floor where she had been drawing strange star symbols onto scraps of paper. "What's that?" she asked softly. Kael placed the bag beside her. "For you." Her eyes widened slightly. Slowly, she opened it. Inside were warm clothes, fresh socks, a toothbrush, and a small silver flashlight. Nothing expensive, but to Lyra it looked priceless. She carefully touched every item inside the bag. Then she hugged it tightly against her chest. Kael smiled quietly and walked into the kitchen. A few minutes later, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned around. Lyra stood there holding the backpack. "You really let me stay?" she asked. Kael frowned slightly. "Of course. For many days." "Yeah." She looked confused by the answer, almost suspicious. Why? Kael leaned against the counter for a moment, thinking carefully. Finally, he shrugged a little. Because someone should. Lyra stared at him silently. Then she gave the smallest smile he had seen yet. That night, after Lyra fell asleep on the couch, Kael sat alone near his old computer terminal. Something about the girl's fear kept bothering him. Children did not ask strangers if they would sell them unless terrible things had already happened. Kael opened a secure colony network and typed several search requests. Missing child reports, alien refugee records, slave transport raids, illegal mining camps. At first, nothing appeared, then finally. One file caught his attention. 3 months earlier, a hidden slave facility had been destroyed near the outer mining sectors. Several prisoners escaped during the attack. Among them was an unidentified alien woman carrying a small child. Status: unknown. Kael's expression darkened. The report included one blurry security image. The woman's face was difficult to see, but the child in her arms had long white hair, just like Lyra. Kael leaned back slowly. "So that's where you came from," he whispered. Suddenly, a soft sound came from the hallway. Outside his apartment, Kael quickly turned off the screen. Another sound, footsteps, slow, careful. He stood quietly and moved toward the door. The hallway outside was dark and silent. But near the stairwell at the far end, a shadow moved. Someone was there, watching. Kael stepped forward. "Who's there?" The figure immediately disappeared down the stairs. Kael cursed under his breath and followed quickly. He rushed down 3 floors and pushed open the building exit door. Cold wind hit his face instantly. The streets outside were nearly empty. But then, movement. A hooded figure limped around the corner of a nearby alley. Kael followed carefully. His heartbeat quickened. The alley was narrow and dark, filled with steam from broken pipes. Trash moved across the ground in the wind. Then he saw her. An alien woman sat against the wall behind a stack of cargo crates, weak, injured, breathing hard. One of her legs was wrapped in dirty cloth stained with blood. She looked up sharply when Kael approached. Fear filled her eyes immediately. Kael slowly raised both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. The woman stared at him with panic and exhaustion mixed together. Then her eyes moved to the jacket he was wearing. Lyra still wore his old mechanic badge pinned onto the sleeve earlier that morning. The woman saw it, and suddenly her entire expression changed. Her lips trembled. "You!" she whispered weakly. Kael carefully knelt a few feet away. "You've been watching the apartment," he said softly. The woman looked down in shame. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then finally, with tears forming in her eyes, she asked. The only thing that mattered to her, "Is my daughter alive?" Kael's chest tightened instantly. He nodded once. "She's safe." The woman covered her mouth with shaking hands. A broken sound escaped her throat. Not quite crying, not quite relief. Something deeper. Kael watched as tears rolled silently down her face. "She talks about you every night," he said gently. The woman closed her eyes tightly. "She remembers me?" Kael gave a small nod. "All the time." The alien woman lowered her head and began to cry quietly in the darkness. And for the first time since finding Lyra, Kael finally understood just how much pain both of them had survived. Rain hammered against the windows that night. Cold wind moved through the streets of Colony Eryndor-7 while warning sirens echoed far above the factory towers. Most people stayed inside during storms like this, but inside Kael's apartment, nobody slept. The alien woman sat quietly near the kitchen table, wrapped in one of Kael's old blankets. Her silver-white hair still looked wet from the rain outside. Small cuts covered her face and arms, and every movement showed pain in her injured leg. Yet her eyes never left the little girl sleeping on the couch. Lyra had cried herself to sleep in her mother's arms only an hour earlier. Now the room was quiet, except for the sound of rain. Kael placed a warm cup beside the woman carefully. "You should drink something," he said softly. The woman looked at him with tired eyes. "Thank you, human." "Kael," he replied. "My name's Kael." She lowered her head slightly. "I am Seris." Kael nodded once and sat across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel awkward. It felt heavy. Finally, Seris looked toward the sleeping child again. "I thought she was dead," she whispered. Kael stayed quiet. "For weeks, I searched every lower sector," she continued softly. "Every alley, every market, every shelter camp." Her voice shook slightly. "I saw children being sold for food credits, small ones taken onto ships." She stopped speaking for a moment. Her hands trembled around the cup. "I was too late every time." Kael felt anger rise slowly inside him, not toward her, toward the people who had made a mother speak like this. "You hid her to protect her," he said quietly. Seris closed her eyes. "I left her alone." "You saved her." She looked at him again, surprised by the answer. Kael leaned back in his chair. "She's alive because you kept fighting." For the first time since entering the apartment, Seris looked like she wanted to believe that. A soft sound suddenly came from the couch. Lyra moved in her sleep. "Mama." Seris stood instantly and rushed beside her daughter. She gently brushed hair away from the little girl's face. The fear inside her eyes disappeared the moment she touched her child again. Kael watched silently. Something about them hurt to look at. Not because they were broken, because nobody had protected them before now. A few minutes later, Lyra slowly opened her eyes. For one confused moment, she looked around nervously. Then she saw her mother sitting beside her. Instantly, her face softened. "Mama." "I'm here," Seris whispered gently. Lyra wrapped her small arms tightly around her mother's, waist like she was afraid she might disappear again. Kael quietly looked away to give them privacy, but then he heard tiny footsteps approaching. He turned back. Lyra now stood in front of him, while still holding on to Seris's hand. The little girl looked nervous, like she wanted to ask something important. "Kael," she whispered softly. "Yeah?" She hesitated, then finally asked, "Can we stay here?" The question hit him harder than expected. Seris immediately looked embarrassed. "Lyra," she said quietly, "we cannot ask that." "It's okay," Kael interrupted gently. The little girl stared at him with wide, nervous eyes. Kael looked around his small apartment. Old tools, small kitchen, leaking ceiling. Nothing special. But somehow, this place had become the safest thing these two had probably known in years. He looked back at Lyra. "You can stay," he said softly. The little girl's eyes widened. "Really?" Kael nodded once. "For as long as you need." Before he could react, Lyra suddenly hugged him tightly around the waist. Kael froze completely. The child was so small, so light, like she still hadn't fully recovered from weeks of hunger. "You're warm," she whispered against his jacket. Something painful and gentle moved through his chest at the same time. Slowly, awkwardly, Kael rested one hand on her back. Behind them, Seris watched silently. There were tears in her eyes again. But these tears looked different. Not fear, not pain. Hope. For the first time in a long time. Later that night, after Lyra finally fell asleep again, Seris stepped quietly onto the apartment balcony. Rain still fell across the glowing colony streets below. Kael joined her a moment later. "She trusts you quickly," he said. Seris gave a weak smile. She never trusted anyone quickly before. Kael leaned against the railing. She asked me once if I would sell her. Seris's expression broke instantly. Her hands tightened painfully. They used children in the camps, she whispered. Some disappeared and never came back. Kael felt sick. She should never know that kind of fear. She already does, Seris answered sadly. For several seconds, only rain filled the silence between them. Then Seris spoke again. I watched you before tonight. Kael looked toward her. I know. For many days, she admitted quietly. I saw how you treated her. Her eyes lowered. You never shouted, never hurt her. You gave her food before feeding yourself. Kael shrugged lightly. She's a kid. No, Seris whispered softly. You gave her something far more dangerous. Kael frowned slightly. What? The alien woman looked toward the sleeping child inside the apartment. Then she answered quietly. Hope. At that exact moment, neither of them noticed the small surveillance drone hovering silently above the building across the street. Its red scanner light blinked once, then disappeared into the storm. The storm ended before sunrise. Dark clouds slowly moved away from Colony Eryndor-7, leaving the streets wet and silent. Cold morning light reflected across metal rooftops, while factory smoke climbed into the pale sky. But peace did not last long. High above the colony, a black transport ship entered the atmosphere without permission. No colony lights welcomed it. No public signal announced its arrival. The ship moved quietly through the clouds like a predator hunting in darkness. Inside the cockpit, 3 figures sat in silence. Each wore black armor marked with no faction or colony symbol. Professional hunters. The A. Man in the center studied a glowing data screen. Target confirmed, he said coldly. Female survivor and child located in Sector 12. One of the others tilted his head. And the human? The leader's expression hardened. Eliminate him if necessary. Far below them, Kael woke suddenly. His eyes opened the moment he heard it. A sound. Very faint. Mechanical. He sat up instantly on the couch. Years working around machines had trained his ears well. Someone was scanning the building from outside. Kael quietly stood and walked to the apartment window. Across the street, near the old transit tower, he noticed a small red light blinking once in the shadows. A surveillance drone. His stomach tightened immediately. They found us. Behind him, Seris stepped out from the hallway, still half asleep. What's wrong? Kael kept watching the street. We have a problem. Her face lost all color. Within seconds, fear returned to her eyes exactly the way it had the night before. Not panic. Recognition. You know what that drone means? Kael said quietly. Seris nodded. Slowly, they never stop hunting. Lyra appeared beside the hallway doorway, rubbing her tired eyes. Mama? Seris immediately knelt beside her daughter. It's okay, she whispered quickly. Everything's okay. But Kael could hear the fear hidden inside her voice, and so could Lyra. The little girl looked toward the window nervously. They found us? Kael hated how quickly she understood danger. He moved away from the window and grabbed his old mechanic jacket. Pack only what you need, he said firmly. We leave in 5 minutes. Seris looked shocked. Leave? Where? There's an old defense station outside the colony. Kael opened a locked storage cabinet near the wall. I helped repair it years ago. Inside the cabinet were things Seris had never seen before. Shock grenades, old security drones, pulse. Rifles, emergency combat gear. Seris stared at him. You were military? Kael loaded power cells into one of the rifles calmly. Long time ago. You never said anything. I didn't want that life anymore. His voice sounded distant now, like someone remembering painful things. Lyra stood quietly beside her backpack while Kael prepared weapons. The little girl looked smaller than ever, tiny hands gripping the straps tightly. "Are bad people coming?" she asked softly. Kael walked toward her and crouched down. "Yes," he answered honestly. Lyra lowered her eyes. "Because of us?" Kael gently lifted her chin. "No," he said firmly. "Because of them." For a moment, Lyra simply stared at him. Then she gave a small nod, like she believed him completely. An hour later, the three of them moved carefully through the lower colony streets. Morning fog covered the roads while transport workers filled the upper sectors. Nobody paid attention to one tired mechanic walking beside two cloaked figures. But Kael stayed alert the entire time. Every shadow, every rooftop, every passing drone. His hand never moved far from the pulse pistol hidden under his jacket. Finally, they reached the outer edge of the colony. Beyond the city stood red stone cliffs and abandoned mining roads stretching into empty wastelands, and hidden between those cliffs. The defense station. The structure looked half buried under sand and rust. Most people would never notice it from a distance. Kael opened the heavy metal door manually. Dust moved through the dark hallways inside. Emergency lights flickered weakly. Above them, Lyra held tightly onto Seris's hand. "This place feels scary," she whispered. Kael walked deeper inside. "It's safe." For the next several hours, Kael worked non-stop. Power systems came online one by one. Security cameras activated. Old defense turrets rotated slowly back to life. Seris watched him quietly. "You prepared for war very fast," she said softly. Kael tightened bolts onto a damaged drone. "I learned a long time ago that bad people don't wait." She studied him carefully. "There's more pain inside you than you show." Kael stopped working for a moment, then continued again silently. That alone gave her the answer. As night slowly approached, the old station finally hummed with power again. Outside, cold wind moved through the cliffs. Inside, Lyra had fallen asleep, wrapped in blankets near one of the heaters. Seris stood beside Kael near the control room. "You could still leave," she whispered. "Take a ship. Forget us before they arrive." Kael looked toward the sleeping child, then toward her. "No." Seris's voice became quieter. "They'll kill you for helping us." Kael stepped closer. "Then they'll have to work very hard to do it." For the first time since meeting him, Seris smiled without fear behind it. A real smile. But before either of them could speak again, one of the radar screens suddenly flashed red. Warning. Multiple hostile signals detected. Kael's entire expression changed instantly. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark cliffs, engines roared in the distance. The hunters had arrived. The sound of engines echoed through the cliffs like thunder. Inside the old defense station, every warning light flashed red. Lyra woke immediately. Fear filled her dark eyes as she sat up from the blankets. "Mama?" Seris rushed beside her and pulled her close. "It's okay," she whispered softly, even though her own hands were shaking. Kael stood in front of the control screens, watching several red signals move closer across the radar map. 3 enemy. Speeders, fast-armed and getting closer every second. Kael grabbed his rifle from the table. "They're here." The room suddenly felt smaller, colder. Danger pressed against the walls like a living thing. Seris stepped toward him. "You don't have to do this." Kael looked at her calmly. "I already decided." Outside, powerful lights swept across the rocky cliffs. The hunters were searching. Kael moved quickly through the station, activating the last defense systems. Old metal doors sealed shut one after another. Hidden turrets rotated into position. The entire station groaned as emergency power fully awakened. Lyra watched silently from the corner. Small. Terrified. trying hard not to cry. Kael noticed immediately. He walked toward her and knelt down. "Hey." Lyra looked up at him slowly. "You remember what I told you?" She nodded weakly. "Bad people only scary when good people stop fighting." Kael smiled a little. "That's right." He carefully placed a small communication device into her tiny hands. "If anything happens, stay with your mother and hide in the lower tunnel." Lyra's eyes immediately filled with tears. "You come back too?" The question hit harder than any weapon ever could. Kael gently touched her head. "I'll always come back for you." Suddenly, boom, the entire station shook violently. Dust fell from the ceiling. One of the outer defense walls exploded on the security screen. "They started early," Kael muttered. A cold voice echoed through the station speakers moments later. "Human mechanic, hand over the fugitives and you survive." Kael grabbed his rifle. "No deal." The voice laughed softly. "Then die with them." Gunfire exploded outside. The battle had begun. Kael moved through the dark hallways quickly, using old security paths only he knew. On nearby screens, black-armored hunters advanced through the cliffs carefully. Professional killers. Not random bounty hunters. One activated a scanning drone, another carried heavy plasma weapons. They expected a fight. Kael gave them one. He triggered. The first trap remotely. An explosion ripped through the canyon entrance, throwing 2 hunters against the rocks. Warning alarms screamed across the station. The remaining attackers spread out immediately. Smart, trained, dangerous. Inside the control room, Seris held Lyra tightly while watching security screens. "Kael," she whispered. Then suddenly, movement behind them. One hunter had entered through an upper ventilation shaft. Seris reacted instantly. She grabbed a metal tool from the table and struck the attacker before he could raise his weapon. The hunter crashed. "Sideways into the wall," Lyra screamed. The attacker recovered quickly and reached for Seris. But before he could touch her, Kael appeared from the doorway and fired. The pulse blast threw the hunter backward across the room. Silence followed. Smoke drifted slowly through the air. Kael looked toward Seris immediately. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, breathing hard, but her eyes were locked onto him. Not fear, something deeper. Trust. Outside, another explosion shook the station. Kael checked the radar screen. More enemies were moving closer. Too many. "We can't hold forever," Seris whispered. Kael stayed silent for several seconds. Then he made a decision. He activated the station's emergency beacon. A powerful signal shot into the sky above the cliffs. Colony security frequency. Seris looked shocked. "You called the authorities?" Kael reloaded his rifle. "I called old friends." Minutes felt like hours. Gunfire echoed constantly outside while the station defenses slowly failed one by one. Then suddenly, a loud roar filled the sky above the canyon. Large patrol ships descended through the clouds, bright security lights covered the battlefield instantly. The hunters froze. One tried to escape. Too late. Armed patrol officers surrounded the cliffs from every direction. The fight ended almost immediately. Hours later, silence finally returned. Cold morning sunlight slowly touched the rocky canyon walls. The danger was over. Inside the damaged station, Lyra sat quietly beside Kael while medics treated a cut across his shoulder. "You came back," she whispered. Kael smiled tiredly. "Told you." Without warning, the little girl wrapped both arms around him tightly. "My papa strong." Kael closed his eyes for a moment. That word still felt strange. But somehow, right. Across the room, Seris watched them quietly. There were tears in her eyes again. Only this time, they were not tears of fear or pain. They were tears of relief. Later that evening, the 3 of them returned to Kael's apartment. The colony looked different now. Neighbors no longer stared coldly. Some even smiled. News of the battle had already spread across Eryndor-7, the human mechanic who protected an alien mother and child, against bounty hunters. For the first time since arriving on the colony, Seris no longer felt invisible. That night, warm light filled the apartment again. Lyra sat on the floor, drawing happily with colored pens, while Kael repaired a broken kitchen light. Seris stood quietly near the window, watching both of them. Watching, something she thought she had lost forever. Peace. Finally, she walked slowly toward Kael. He looked up from his tools. What? Seris hesitated nervously, then softly asked, "After everything, can we stay with you?" The room became very quiet. Kael looked toward Lyra. The little girl already watched him hopefully. Then he looked back at Seris, at the tired woman who survived chains, fear, and darkness just to save her child. Slowly, Kael smiled. "I think," he said gently, "you already belong here." Seris's eyes filled with tears again. But this time, she smiled too. And for the first time in many years, none of them felt alone anymore.